know. Sometimes I feel personally some pressure of kind of having to have it all together because I am a provider in the mental health field, and I should know all the coping skills, and I should know, all the ways of taking care of my mental health, which of course I think in many ways I do, but I think that speaks all the more to we can have all the coping skills in the world, but that doesn't mean we're immune in any means to experiencing mental health struggles, including burnout.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Shrinking Burnout. Today we have a very special guest, Angie, a social worker working in a hospital in the Northeast. So far, we've heard the perspective from a lot of doctors, but it's very important that we also hear from our social workers, because burnout is not unique to any one specialty or field. So Angie, tell us more about yourself.
Hi guys, my name's Angie. I'm a social worker on an inpatient psychiatry unit at a large hospital in the Northeast. I've been there now for a few years, and it's been a great experience. I think working on an inpatient psychiatry unit, we are working with patients in some of their most difficult moments in life, and being able to support them and help them get back on their feet has been very rewarding. Prior to working on an inpatient psychiatry unit, I've primarily been working in different mental health settings, partial hospital programs in different outpatient settings.
Great. Welcome to the show, Angie. And I think some of the viewers might be asking why we're having a social worker on the podcast. And the thing is, in terms of burnout, clinicians in all specialties and all disciplines can experience burnout. And even when you look at it historically, the term burnout actually originated with a psychologist who was really working with some social workers in an addictions clinic back in 1975. We wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on clinician burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of my own experience, I think thinking about social work in general, I think often people are just confused about the role about social work and what do social workers do. And I'm imagining a lot of people listening to this podcast probably are familiar with the role of social work, but just in case people aren't familiar, social workers can work in settings from hospitals, all sorts of clinics, working with elderly populations in nursing homes and assisted livings, working in schools, working in outpatient mental health clinics, doing individual therapy, doing case management, working in addictions. I'm sure I've missed a bunch of things, but it's really a broad position, which is really nice in a lot of ways. And I think in terms of thinking about burnout, again, I've personally worked mainly in the mental health field, which I think burnout certainly is very common, but I think, across the medical field, it's something that within social work is definitely common. And again, I'm so glad that you guys are tackling this topic. I was listening to some previous podcast episodes, and, you guys discussed the stigma about burnout. And I think talking about this stuff, that's why it's so important to be open about these conversations to reduce the stigma.
And in the social work world, what is the stigma like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, at least, again, for myself working specifically in mental health, there might be more of a stigma in ways for mental health professionals to be open about burnout and dealing with mental health issues, which is funny. You would think it's a kind of an oxymoron in that way, that you think all the more we would feel comfortable being able to have these conversations. But I don't know, sometimes I feel personally some pressure of kind of having to have it all together because I am a provider in the mental health field, and I should know all the coping skills, and I should know, all the ways of taking care of my mental health, which of course I think in many ways I do, but I think that speaks all the more to we can have all the coping skills in the world, but that doesn't mean we're immune in any means to experiencing mental health struggles, including burnout.
I think, Angie, you actually bring up a very good point when it comes to mental health workers and talking about burnout. We learn a lot about strategies and coping skills so that when another one of our colleagues are expressing any sort of distress, burnout, or any sort of mental health issue like anxiety or depression, the automatic thought for a lot of these mental health workers is to shift into a way to try to solve their problems. Mm. This is something that I've seen when I've experienced any sort of burnout, or, when I'm seeing my colleagues express that they're feeling a little bit worn down from the work that they're doing, and then just seeing the response, which is always some sort of problem solving type of mode. And that's always been really frustrating for me to encounter.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think often we do go into that problem solving mode, whether it's with colleagues, whether it may be with friends or families, or even ourselves, instead of sometimes just sitting and listening and being there, as a support.
Yeah, and just in terms of really speaking on the sense as a mental health worker that you really have to have your act together. I don't know what you think about this, Angie, but I feel like a lot of that pressure comes from the fact that we don't want to be looked or perceived as a patient with our colleagues.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's tough sometimes to be vulnerable and start the conversation if others haven't.
And in your own personal experience, have you found that it's been harder to open up to some of your colleagues about, say, your feelings when you are feeling overwhelmed or burnt out?
I think so. It's tough to say, but I do think there are times where maybe I did need a mental health day. I think I haven't always been comfortable saying that. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, how working in the mental health field, providers aren't able to say, you know what, I need a mental health day for myself today. And I hope we can get to that point where we can be more open and honest about that.
So in terms of your day-to-day responsibilities, can you tell us a little bit more about the type of specific tasks that you usually are, taking charge of?
Sure. So on the inpatient psychiatry floor that I work on, we work closely together with the other disciplines, with the psychiatrists, with the nurses, occupational therapists. We'll meet often as a team with the patients. In my role, often, I will be providing different therapeutic interventions, whether it's providing education on different therapeutic techniques and coping skills and one-on-one sessions. And in addition to that, there are some case management duties, which include making referrals to outpatient providers, helping people to find a therapist, a psychiatrist in the community, to make sure that they're leaving with as much support as they can. And other parts of our role include collaborating with family members, making sure that they have support around this as well, because it often impacts family members just as much as patients. So that kind of summarizes a lot of what we do.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, Angie. And I think reflecting upon all the work that you're doing, are you able to share a little bit about what are some of the things that cause you to experience some distress or burnout?
Personally, something that's contributed to my burnout is kind of how other people perceive social work's role, in a sense, and not allowing us to have the space to maybe provide more therapeutic interventions, and just seeing us as case managers and focusing on the discharge planning, for example, but not valuing what we're bringing to the table in terms of our clinical skill set. I think that's something that historically social work has had to do in terms of explaining our role and what we do and what our skill set is. In regards to burnout, I think part of the reason why I went into this field is to focus on that, more of the therapeutic piece of the treatment, and not just like the discharge planning, which sometimes I think we might have to remind people, because that's really the fulfilling work, I think, is being able to provide that support. So I think that's something that I personally have faced, and I believe other social workers in this role have faced as well.
One thing, Angie, that I'm hearing is that some of the day-to-day frustration is from the interdisciplinary aspects of the work. Feeling exhausted that you have to almost re-explain what your role is. And I think the other aspect is, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are aspects of feeling almost devalued due to these sort of preconceived notions of what your responsibilities are.
I think you summarized it well. I think it is a challenge that we face. And again, we try to do our part to kind of explain what our role is and advocate for having a seat at the table. And I think, again, that comes back to kind of the culture of the unit. And, I hope that we can have these open conversations to be able to provide education about what our role is and what we're bringing in terms of our skills, that it's an important part of the treatment.
You know what this topic that you guys are talking about brings to mind for me? This concept of the hierarchy in terms of the medical hierarchy And then kind of with what you just said about the interdisciplinary nature of medicine, and this may be my cynical opinion on the word interdisciplinary, but when I hear interdisciplinary, I hear medical hierarchy just with the undertones. Because to clarify what interdisciplinary means, it means a team of physicians, nurses, social workers, patient care technicians that are also there on the unit. They're all kind of together. And in terms of who gets, like you said, the proverbial seat at the table, who gets the final say, who gets the decisions, it's tough trying to navigate through all of those voices. And I think when you're not the person that's the quote unquote chief decision maker, even though apparently with interdisciplinary work, there is no chief decision maker, but the hidden message, which is never really talked about, I think, is the fact that there probably is some sort of hierarchy that nobody talks about. And because nobody's talking about it, that's when people feel like they're more burnt out, they feel more powerless, and they feel more hopeless because they're not actually talking about the fact that there is a hierarchy. And being able to understand that and talk about it, I think is one of the first steps in breaking this down.
No, I 100% agree, Andy. I think one thing we sort of tiptoe around, and it's the idea that we want to, at least externally, show that we're very respectful, we treat each other very equally. But I mean, I personally, have definitely been on teams where I was quite shocked and surprised to hear, especially in medical school, some of the opinions of, say, other coworkers, other residents, so on and so forth, about their opinions on the other members of the team, including nursing staff, social work. And I think, it ultimately comes down to mutual respect. And I think when it comes to a hierarchy, that can be challenging to make sure that you still have that mutual respect. And I think the fact that there even is a hierarchy in an interdisciplinary setting is pretty much counterproductive at that point. Is it really interdisciplinary in that case?
There are so many unbelievable opportunities working for a big institution, but I do think it can bring its own challenges in terms of hierarchies and politics at times. And I think being able to just have these candid conversations and be transparent is how we really kind of work through it. And like you guys said, kind of avoid burnout or work through burnout in a way, because I think if we just pretend like it's not happening, and that's really not addressing the issue.
Yeah. And Angie, the other thing that you mentioned with what you do as an inpatient social worker is with the disposition planning, and how you often feel like the only thing that you're doing is just doing dispositional management and planning and things like that. And I do want to highlight, and I may sound like a broken record now, but just in terms of the systems-wide issues with inpatient psychiatric care, there is a push in large institutions to try to get patients out as soon as possible. And when you see more patients and when you try to discharge more patients, there's more disposition planning to do. And I could see how if you are the social worker and there's all this institution-wide push to try to get all of these patients out of there, then of course the people from the top are always going to be asking the social workers to be doing more and more disposition planning. And you feel sort of powerless because that's not all that you do. That's not all that you want to do. And the reason why you went into social work is not because you can do more dispositions and set up PCP appointments.
And I know that's something you guys addressed in an earlier episode. And I think, systemically, it does come down to that. We really could benefit from additional social workers. We could benefit from additional support in terms of discharge planning and setting up appointments. And
I mean, it's crazy that it has to be justified for me, because it's very clear that social workers especially are quite overburdened in general, and I have seen that firsthand in multiple hospitals, multiple settings. I think often, as you mentioned, the actual role of a social worker isn't accurately or clearly even delineated to all members of the team. And I think that's a real problem.
I think when you're in a large institution and you're dealing with all these different disciplines and you want to try to understand what everybody else does in terms of these different disciplines, But the sad matter is, or the reality is that everyone's really too busy, either because of paperwork or administrative issues, that they're not actually able to know what everybody else is actually doing or what they can actually potentially provide when it comes to patient care. And it's really sad, I think, that we aren't able to appreciate this. And with this system that's set in place for us, we end up having a lot of potentially disrespectful outcomes that can happen.
I mean, often it becomes a very thankless job. I think the things that you end up doing, you often end up spreading yourself thin. It sounds like people want social workers to sort of solve all these complicated family situations, which obviously no one is going to be able to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And I think, like you said, often in the mental health field, especially I think on inpatient psychiatry, we see patients who are in really vulnerable positions, many patients who are homeless, or patients who have been dealing with mental illness for many years, and their family members are at a loss about what to do, and they're turning to us for guidance, and often there are just not the resources to be able to support patients in the way that their families are hoping for, in terms of group homes, for example, or housing options. There are just such few resources out there, and it can be very discouraging to be able to, sit with patients and families in this situation and not be able to offer more support. So I think those things can certainly contribute to burnout.
And Angie, just to shift gears a little bit, what are some things that really keep you interested in the field and really have you maintain that interest in being a social worker?
What drew me into social work specifically was because it is very strengths-based, and we focus on the person in their environment. And I remember, for example, at my orientation for social work school, one of the speakers talked about how we have a client who's depressed, but their utilities are shut off and they don't have food in their fridge. We can't really focus on sitting in a therapy session and, just focus on talk therapy. We may need to address the acute issues at hand in terms of making sure all their psychosocial needs are met. So I think that kind of perspective is what really led me to choosing to go to social work school and wanting to become a social worker. And that's what I try to keep in mind. I think that's what keeps me coming to work every day.
And during this quarantine, what are some of the challenges that you've come across?
The discharge planning role is already challenging, but add, a pandemic on top of it, and there've been a whole new array of challenges that have come up in terms of just providers that are available and just what that looks like in terms of this new wave of telehealth. It's really interesting. It's brought up challenges that I think have been unforeseen for most people, in that with a lot of our older population, for example, who may not be as tech savvy, just trying to navigate how they're going to be able to follow up with appointments after this has been a challenge that we've been facing. Or, for example, there was a homeless patient that I was working with that didn't have a cell phone. We were able to find a cell phone for him, but he actually turned it down because he felt like it would be more of a liability having a cell phone on him, and that it would likely get stolen. So, it brings up these questions. How do some of these vulnerable populations and patients follow up with care, in this new kind of way of looking at treatment? Kind of going back to the theme of burnout during COVID, I think everyone can relate to the fact that everything just seems more emotionally exhausting. I found myself just questioning everything in a way. It's like you get home, you take off your shoes, you try to unpack and shower, and then it's like, I know myself, like I go to grab my water bottle and it's like, oh wait, do I have to wash my water bottle? Do I have to wash my cell phone? Did I touch this? And the fear of spreading, unknowingly spreading the virus to loved ones at home, and potentially bringing it onto the unit and spreading it to patients each day, I think is certainly, emotionally exhausting at times. And, having to go through this every day and then show up to work and then pretend that business this, as usual, is something that I think that I've been struggling with. Working in the mental health field, something that I did want to touch upon is this idea of vicarious trauma, which is kind of the idea that folks in the mental health field, or I'm sure just the helping fields in general, kind of hearing these stories of trauma day in and day out, just acknowledging the impacts it has on us as clinicians. And that's something that we don't always talk about, I think, openly, just the impacts that it can have on us.
And Angie, when it comes to burnout, some people like to talk about the work-life balance. And it's really hard for anybody working in clinical medicine, whatever discipline they are, to just simply just turn off their brain and turn on their life mode, after they finish working. Because we really see a lot of messed up stuff. And if you're expected to just go home and just, keep on doing whatever it is that you do at home and, spend time with your family, spend time with your loved ones, and you don't have an opportunity to be able to talk about whatever crazy thing that happens on a hospital on a daily basis. We treat people with crazy social situations. We see patients with all sorts of addictions issues. We see patients where the system has failed them. For more medical workers, we see a lot of death too. And if you just say that you finish your shift and you come home and that's it, and you're totally fine as long as you get a couple of days of rest, that's completely bogus, because you need to be able to, and honestly, I don't know what better solution to this would be. It's just hard when you set up something like a work-life balance to say, like, there's a split. You work, you go home, and then everything's all good.
I hope my boyfriend doesn't kill me for sharing this, but one day, he made a comment like, "Oh, you're so depressing." And it kind of struck me a little bit, because I think generally I am a very positive and kind of happy-go-lucky person, but at the same rate, I do think working in this field after a period of time, it does kind of get to you.
Angie, I think we covered some very important topics today. Thank you so much for your candor and transparency. I think it's hard to be honest and open about burnout, as you had mentioned, due to a lot of the stigma associated with doing so. So Angie, do you have anything else that you'd like to say to our viewers?
I think we all preach self-care, but I think it's important to practice what we preach. Medical professionals shouldn't be ashamed for seeing their own therapist. I think if anything, actually, they should be praised for seeking that self-care for themselves. And I think just really taking the time to reflect on what we all need as providers at the end of the day, and what we can do to make sure that we're making more time for ourselves, however much that time is. I know it can be hard to squeeze in, but I do think that is important. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for having me on the show. You guys are doing an amazing job at just highlighting the importance of having these conversations and, taking care of ourselves amidst taking care of others during this pandemic, especially.
Thank you for those kind words, Angie.
And thank you to our listeners. If you have any suggestions, comments, questions, or would like to be anonymously interviewed, please email us at shrinkingburnout@gmail.com. We would like to honor your privacy while hearing about your experiences during these difficult times.
Shrinking Burnout is a podcast about furthering the discussion of clinician burnout and recognizing the resilience and hard work that clinicians regularly demonstrate. Nothing on this show should be taken as medical or psychiatric advice. All of the opinions expressed on this podcast are solely our own and do not reflect those of our employer.